My co-authors and I want to thank the organizers of the Belize Heritage Education Network for their invitation to be part of this great symposium. Today we plan to talk about the historical component of our archaeological project in Belize and also the collaborative development of a community museum in Crooked Tree, Belize. This slide shows the extent of the Belize River East Archaeology study area. It's here in gray. And my project area here encompasses the lower half of the Belize River Watershed, so extends basically between Belmopan and Belize City. And, initially when I started the BREA project 10 years ago, I admit my initial goal was, like most archaeologists in Belize, to simply document the ancient Maya settlement in this area. However, it quickly became apparent to our team that in addition to a whole bunch of ancient Maya sites, there was also a wealth of colonial sites in the lower half of the Belize River watershed. And fortunately for us, my co-author and BREA team member, Dr. Adam Keating, is a historical archaeology specialist. So over the last decade, the BREA project has turned our attention to recording the historical archaeology in this area, and specifically the Creole history, which in Belize has remained largely undocumented archaeologically. And as most of you know, the Creole are descendants of European and enslaved Africans who were originally brought to Belize by the British to work in the logging industry during the 17th and 18th centuries. And many of the lower Belize River watershed is often referred to as the birthplace of Kriol culture. And many of the historic communities, including Crooked Tree, located right here, were originally established as logging camps, and most today are comprised of direct descendants of mixed African and European descent. Notably, many of the rural communities in this area show signs of dwindling populations as in some cases, some communities have been abandoned altogether as young people move to be closer to the cities and the highways. For instance, all of these Creole communities here in the middle reaches of the river valley between Mount Pleasant and Coquericut, where we've conducted archaeological survey. None of these villages exist today, with the exception of More Tomorrow here, which, like Crooked Tree, is considered one of the oldest Creole communities in the country. So an overarching goal of the BREA project has been to document and promote this rich history, specifically the Creole history, whose culture remains largely undocumented archaeologically, and is to some extent at risk of being erased. As a result, community-engaged archaeology has become a central part of the Belize River East Archaeology project. And here, our BREA archaeological excavations have been directly informed by local community members who provided us with valuable oral histories about the area, specifically around Crooked Tree, and directed us to locations in the village where indeed we found archaeological evidence for the earliest historical occupation. Local community members are serving not only as our guides and our teachers in their history, but they've also helped us in the excavations themselves. Many were already trained from working on past archaeological projects, including the excavations at Chow Heesh, Maya site, which was directed by Dr. Ann Pyburn some years ago, and others were trained in archaeological field methods by our BREA team. And so here we're going to talk more about the results of our community engaged project, beginning with a discussion of our excavations around the village of Crooked Tree, and then talk about how the results of the BREA project are the feature of a community archaeology museum in the village of Crooked Tree. It was specifically selected as a site for this museum and learning center because the community holds this really valuable repository of colonial archaeology, and the community members also hold this wealth of local knowledge in the form of oral histories. And I developed the Crooked Tree Museum in partnership with the local community, but I also relied, I should mention, on my amazing collaborator, Dr. Sarah Clark de Reza, who's also a co-author on this paper. And she's a specialist in museum education, and she's also a professor at Washington College. Now, the museum presents the deep history of human-environment interactions in the lower Belize River watershed. So this spans as much as 10,000 years of continuous human occupation. So from Paleo-Indian times through the ancient Maya and into the colonial period, which is really the feature of the museum, this rich colonial history involving the Creole people who still live in this area today. Now, most of our historical investigations in and around Crooked Tree have focused on an area around the Baptist church in the village, which the site itself dates to a period in the 19th century following the abolition of slavery in 1838. This period often referred to as the post-emancipation society. Locals informed us that this location marked the earliest village occupation and that it was founded by two brothers, William and George Tilletton, who were first-generation Creole and whose descendants actually still live in the village today. And one of the buildings, this one right here, it was originally built in 1835, and it served as the original Baptist church and also the first school in the village. And here it's being shown, here you can see it actually being used as a school in the 1940s. And our investigations were guided by a combination of sources, including the stories of village elders who actually remember attending the school as children, and also this historical map that you can see here from 1868 that we recovered from the Belize National Archives. And I'm going to come back to this shortly, but we were given permission to excavate this area by the village chairman, as well as the pastor of the Baptist church. Now, the BREA team developed a strategy to investigate the archaeology, employing several different methodologies designed to investigate specific areas of the churchyard and the area surrounding, right, what is the modern church, and then also this historic building that I mentioned previously. We carried out a series of shovel test pits, STPs, that you can see demarcated here in this aerial image, and also some larger test excavations with sort of broader horizontal exposure of certain areas where we found high densities of artifacts. A member of the BREA team, Lori Phillips, she developed a series of heat maps that you can see here highlighting artifact densities. And although shovel test pitting does not tell you how things change through time, they are particularly well suited to help identify the horizontal distribution of artifacts across the site. So it tells you which areas contain higher or lower densities of artifacts, and they show you the different kinds of artifacts that are distributed across the site here. So for instance, this is a distribution of the historic ceramics that we found. This is the distribution of the historical glass. This is the distribution of historical metal. And this is the distribution of pipe fragments. While the pipes were actually our latest artifact class, we couldn't help but notice the clustered distribution right outside of the church here. And when I asked the pastor actually about the smoking habits of the 19th century parishioners, he clarified to me that it was probably the neighbors who threw those pipes over the fence. So. All right, so we compared what we were finding archaeologically with the 1868 map. And this tall structure right here, and of course, as I mentioned, was the original church and school. We believe that's what's shown in the map here, in the high stilted structure. And that it was two stories actually, originally, and later blew down. The top story blew down during the 1931 hurricane. It was re-erected and then it eventually positioned where it is today, but roughly in the same location. And this also, in relation to some of the old roads we can see in the map and also today. We started to look in other areas here and found what we believe is this structure, which may represent the house of William Tillet. The relative location of these two buildings also aligns what we found archaeologically. And we wondered then, what would this area represent here, where we see these two structures here? And when we asked locals, what do you recall was over there? Their answer was the outhouses, where they also said they used to dump trash, which for historical archaeologists, right, we're thinking, ding, 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 this is great. A gold mine. Outhouses, also known as privies, often provide some of the most useful information because after they get filled up, they then are turned into often trash dumps, and they get sealed over with refuse. So sure enough, when we look at our heat map, right, it lit up in this area with a spike in artifact densities. And we can see on the ground surface multiple pairs of depression that really indicate, right, we're dealing with outhouses. And so we decided to open up this area, an excavation here, up 37 in this location, and found beautifully preserved barrel-lined privies, one filled with trash from the late 1800s. And so during our excavation season, we held an open archaeology day at the site and invited members of the community to come and visit, ask questions, see what we were uncovering in the excavations, and teachers actually brought all of their students. We had 78 students ages 7 to 14 come over on a walking field trip from the Crooked Tree School, and we showed them the excavations, shared with them the artifacts we were finding, talked about how we do archaeology. And when we brought them there over to the Privy, there was certainly a lot of curiosity, a lot of questions. And we say, if they didn't think we were weird already, this kind of sealed the deal for these guys. But they're excavating what? They asked. So you can see here BREA project members trying to explain the rationale for excavating a toilet to one of the elders here from the community who came for a tour. This gentleman's actually in his 80s, and he not only attended the school as a child, but is a direct descendant of William Tillett. So he actually still speaks with a slight Scottish brogue. So it's in our conversations with these elders, right? We hear about we can hear their European ancestry there for sure. And we also hear their stories of what they remember about attending the Baptist church school as young children. They describe the different kinds of writing implements they used to use. They mention using slate and chalk as young children. And as they got older, they moved to the classroom on the second floor of the school where they got to use inkwells and quill pens. So in our excavations, we indeed found fragments of such implements and a large number of slate fragments, such as the examples shown here. We also found toys indicative of children, such as these doll parts and marbles. And actually, elders recalled to us playing marbles as a kind of a memorable pastime here. And we can also see we found on the last day of excavations this iron cross in our excavations. So letting us know that there was certainly long-term presence of a church in this location. And we also found many different kinds of decorated plates, bowls, mugs, and the kinds of serving wares, right, that villagers used to serve up their meals on. We also found the bones from those animals that made up some of those meals. And in a lot of ways, Crooked Tree in the 19th century was an isolated community. It was located far from any cities out in what was then the remote frontier of the former British colony. There was no road to the island, to Crooked Tree. Crooked Tree, if you don't know, is an island. And it wasn't until 1983 that there was a bridge built there. So boat was really the only way in. And yet we see in these artifacts that the people in Crooked Tree were still incorporated into the wider global community, lining their tables with these ceramics and glassware that was made in Europe. And this is really the same is true of the large collection of imported pipe bowls. As you can see here, some pipe stems to smoke tobacco, likely brought in from elsewhere. So these artifacts, along with this large amount of glassware from wine and liquor bottles, help tell us that, it wasn't all church and school taking place here in the center of town, and aligns with the oral histories and ethnohistoric accounts that describe this place as a small village in the 1840s. What was formerly called Tilletton. You might have seen that label on many of these slides, right? But of course, that name didn't stick. We know it today as Crooked Tree. So the museum's successful development was really contingent on public participation. Our starting point was asking the local Creole community to share their history and to ask them what it was they wanted to learn about in terms of their own history. Our archaeological investigations were guided by local community members who not only provided us with a wealth of valuable oral histories about the area, they guided us on the placement of our excavations, right? And additionally, local villagers trained in archaeological field methods were instrumental in the excavations themselves. So in all these ways, the archaeology was really a collaborative, what we would call a collaborative heritage-oriented project, wherein collective social memory really serves to empower local descendant communities in accessing their own past. In other words, we weren't the experts on this past, they were. And in addition to the artifacts from our excavations, I should add that numerous historical objects were donated by local community members alongside their stories, which together serve to inform the historical reconstructions that are presented in the museum. And the local community was really involved each and every step of the way in the building of this museum, beginning with the donation of the structure in the center of the village that houses the museum exhibition today. The museum itself was designed by a local architect from the village, and we hired local contractors, builders, technicians, and artists to assist in the overhaul of the museum building and in the design of the exhibition. And we were certainly grateful for the continuous support of Niche, including the director of the IA, Dr. John Morris, shown here, who was our keynote speaker for the opening in June of 2018. This day was really a huge success, not only because hundreds attended this celebration, but because people, young and old, engaged with one another and shared in their rich history. And for the long-term success of the museum, we know having engaged and committed stakeholders is really key. The Village Council is who runs the museum today, and our community partners also include local teachers who help shape the exhibit displays and corresponding educational content. And a year after the opening of the museum, my education collaborator, Dr. Sarah Clark DeReza, and I co-organized with the Banquitas House of Culture a teacher workshop and educational training that was accredited actually by the Ministry of Education. And the aim was to encourage teachers across the country to integrate the exhibition and curriculum design into their classroom curricula. And the workshop really was a great success and a lot of fun. And before COVID, we were planning another workshop for the following year that would integrate both teachers and tour guides. So we're hoping to reinstitute the workshop post-pandemic. So I'll conclude by making a final plug for the museum and a shout out to all the teachers and tour guides out there. If you're interested in a future workshop opportunity and or tour of the museum in Crooked Tree, please contact the museum. Here's our Facebook page. And be sure to check out our virtual tour. I'll share a link to that in the live chat. Thank you so much.